Hello everyone. I'm back a lot sooner than I thought. A lot happened today, and let's just say things are moving on the right track. And I feel really good about it too. I think things will go for the better. I think things are going to change for the better on this channel. And I can't wait to pump out new videos that are going to be coming very soon. So, that being said, I'm going to roll out the intro. And hopefully at the end of the intro we'll have some more viewers, and then I will resume the talk. Enjoy. Alright, I'm back. Alright, so it looks like we only have one person watching. That's unfortunate. Even at nighttime, I get some more views than this. Show up the gain here a little bit. So, there's a reason why I interviewed several people on this channel. And what some people don't understand is when one ends up changing his mind often, or her mind often, doesn't matter. If this person over here, that person over here is researching, and they're still trying to figure things out, as we all are. And the fact of the matter is, sometimes it takes making the mistake more than once to realize it's a mistake. Sometimes you say you were wrong about something, then you say you were right about something, and then you end up saying, oh, I was actually wrong after all. That is a method of someone that's keeping their mind open in research, even when they say, I was right about something, but then I turned out to be wrong, but then I thought I was right. You use that methodology to understand that even when you think you're wrong about something, there's still a possibility you could have been right about it after all, even if the evidence is against it. It's all about probability. The methodology I use to determine if something is true is a three-step methodology. Can you prove that something is possible? Then can you prove if that something is probable? And then can you prove is it true? So basically I'm asking myself, is that something possible? Then I ask myself, how probable is it? And then I ask myself, is it true? That's a three-step process, and each process, to get through even one of those steps is very difficult and very tedious, and it takes a lot of work. It's a methodology, it's an epistemology, it's an understanding that people need to use to get through anything to do with historical research, investigations, or whatever it may be, to determining truth. Especially when it comes to ambiguous evidence. And, okay, so Kuzio says, hello Jacob, how are you doing, Kuzio? So, let's talk about something. Let's talk about a mistake that I made in the past. And I made it like twice in a row. And I kept looking at the evidence and I kept saying to myself, wait a minute. I just found new evidence that supported a theory that I abandoned. So, the theory is, if we have a problem with Paul's identity, maybe he's someone else other than who we're being told he is. And I thought, okay, well, maybe that evidence right there is the golden ticket. Maybe that's what I'm looking for. Maybe that's it. But the problem is, really, the problem is, to prove something like that to be true, it would take massive, extraordinary amount of evidence. And I just, after thinking about it, especially after the events that have happened these last few days, I had to realize this is just not provable. It can't be done. And I've always said we need to stick with Paul's epistles and the we document of Acts, the first person narration in some parts of Acts of the Apostles. That's more reliable than the third person narration, which is the majority of Acts. If we're going to stick to that as being the most reliable evidence to access and assess and analyze a historical Paul, then we need to stick to that evidence and not go anywhere else outside of that paradigm, even things like the Clementine literature. Eventually, I had to come to the conclusion the reason why 2nd century Christians were confusing Paul with the high priest Ananias was because Paul was working for that high priest. That's what was happening. Paul was working for Ananias. And we know Ananias killed James. Josephus tells us that. It's very clear he killed James. Nobody debates that. All historians agree he killed James. It's very clear. Now, recognitions of Clement is under the impression that Paul actually killed James. Of course, they offer recognitions of Clement. That was likely Clement of Alexandria. That was around 150 AD, give or take. So mid-2nd century CE dating, or 80, whatever term you prefer. It looks to me that there was a sect of Christianity, a very powerful sect at the time, believed, a very popular sect, I meant to say, a very popular sect of Christianity at the time that believed that Paul killed James, and therefore they identified him with Ananias. But the Pauline epistles don't necessarily suggest that the two people are the same person, but they were actually different. Paul was taught by Barnabas. Now, Barnabas is clearly Ananias, as I've demonstrated before many times. Barnabas was it was a post-Pauline interpolation to remove Ananias from the story. Because Ananias was a controversial figure. He killed James, and to suggest that Paul was working with him and being taught by him would be too controversial for early Christians to deal with. Now, when do the epistles date? The 7 epistles, I agree with consensus that they date before AD 70. And the reason why I came to agree with them is because when I did my own analysis of the letters, I realized that after looking at the interpolations done by Tertius, Clement, and evidently Epaphroditus, there was 3 layers of interpolations into Paul's epistles that I call the tripartite or the tripartite overlay. The tripartite overlay, which developed from an earlier theory that I formed called the dual overlay theory, which was to explain that there were 2 layers of redactions and interpolations in the Pauline corpus. Then I detected there was a third one. There was a third redaction in the Pauline corpus that was done by Epaphroditus. Now, I admit the evidence for that is skewy. It's maybe skewy is the wrong word. It's ambiguous and it's difficult to be completely certain. The only thing that I can safely say I proved is, but because the evidence is overwhelming, Tertius admits he redacted Paul's epistles. Read Romans 16:22. Clement admits he believes that Jesus was a high priest of Jerusalem, and he fails to provide evidence of this from Paul's epistles. And thus, I use that understanding. I use the same methodology, the 3-step methodology, earlier to conclude that Clement had written the book of Hebrews, which even Origen of Alexandria said that the book of Hebrews is a forgery and it was not written by St. Paul. So, how did I determine that Clement wrote Hebrews? Let's examine the possibility. What makes it possible? Clement says that Jesus was a high priest. He's the first person to say it. the book of Hebrews is also the first book, at least it appears to be the first book, that mentions Jesus being a high priest of Jerusalem. It's definitely the first book in the New Testament to suggest that, with the Gospels sort of implying it vaguely, but not going out of their way to exactly say it right off the bat. Hebrews says it right off the bat unambiguously. The Gospels imply it because they say that Jesus was anointed with oil over his head at Bethany. So that is the way a high priest is anointed. So, setting that aside, Clement also spoke of Jesus as being a high priest of Jerusalem. Now, Origen of Alexandria, he lived in the 2nd century CE, late 2nd century CE or AD, and he died in the 3rd century CE. He said that either Clement or Luke wrote Hebrews, but he said, I don't know which one did, but God only knows. So, I concluded the simpler answer to this is that Clement wrote Hebrews, because the author of Luke was not ignorant on the Passion narrative. The author of Hebrews was. So the possibility that Luke wrote Hebrews based on the evidence with Clement and Luke factored in is actually 1/3 probability, because Hebrews paralleling Clement, and Clement talking about Jesus being a high priest and ignorant of the Passion narrative, and Hebrews is also equally ignorant of the Gospel Passion narrative. There's a 2/3 probability that Luke did not write Hebrews. On the same token, there's a 2/3 probability that Clement did write Hebrews. So it's possible Clement wrote Hebrews. We got past step 1. The second step is we determined that there's at least a 2/3 probability. That means the majority of the evidence agrees that Clement likely wrote Hebrews. So I assume, based on that reasoning, that Clement is the most likely author for Hebrews, and therefore I will say he is the author of Hebrews until I receive evidence that states otherwise. Saying that something over here is most likely to be true based on multiple levels of logical reasoning is a nice way of saying it is true until someone demonstrates to me it is not. That's a nice way of saying it. It's a nice way of saying that which I just said. In other words, I'm not dismissing that it could be untrue, that it might not be true, but the evidence overwhelmingly suggests that it is true, because I know we are dealing with probabilities in the end. Now, let's go back to Paul's epistles. Let's apply the same sort of logic with Paul's epistles. And let's take a look at something here. Ocuzio says that's true. Then he says with perfume you mean. Ocuzio says Jesus was anointed with perfume at Bethany. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. So, that being said, let's apply the same logic to Paul's authentic epistles. So the consensus says that there are 7 letters that Paul wrote. 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, 1 Thessalonians, Romans, and Philippians. I think I got all the names down. Okay. Now, here's something I want to point out. The way they argue that Paul wrote 7 letters, in my opinion, they argue it poorly. I think they're right in the end. I concluded that they're correct. But the way they say it, I think they present the argument poorly. I'll explain why. They say, well, because letters like Ephesians, Hebrews, Colossians, 2 Thessalonians, and there are 2 other letters that I'm forgetting their names. There are 2 letters. I'm forgetting their names. 2 pseudepigraphical Pauline epistles that Paul did not write, and I'm forgetting their names. Titus, 1st, 2nd Timothy. So that was actually 3 letters I forgot. All right, so Paul did not write those 7, And they assume that the other 7 was written by Paul because it was written by a different author, and they assume it was written by Paul. All they did was prove that we have at least 2 different authors. We have one person that wrote the other 7, one person that wrote the other 7. So how do we determine which set of 7 was written by Paul? From my own methodology, I determined that the same 7 letters that the consensus scholars say was written by Paul was actually written by him. All right, so let's go through it. Galatians, which is supposed to be an example of a true Pauline epistle, written around 62 AD at the latest. Galatians has Paul being right there front and center, arguing against James and Cephas. James and Cephas reject the crucifixion of Jesus. They reject Paul's arguments regarding the Torah. They reject his anti-circumcision position. And they're having a very, very heated argument about it. And Paul is very angry. He talks about in Galatians 3 that the Galatians are foolish for not believing his arguments. In Galatians 1:1, he talks about his greetings to the Galatians, and he goes onwards in Galatians 1:19 and 1:20, talking about James is the brother of the Lord, but he says, I'm not a liar afterwards. So there's a lot going on in Galatians. And how I determined that is authentic, I do something different than what the consensus scholars do. Galatians mentions 14 years. And 2 Corinthians mentions another set of 14 years. And Galatians mentions another set of 3 years. Add that all up together, and it adds up to 31 years. So as suspicious as those numbers are, but if you add it all up to 31, and you do 31 minus 62 CE, it's 31 CE, or 80. So, Paul is aware of his own chronology. That's not something an interpolator that's just making up Paul's epistles whole cloth would have been aware of. And there would be no reason for that chronology to be forged. It makes no sense. Unless they are authentic and Paul is aware of his own ministry and his own history. That's because they were written by Paul himself. It's the only way that's the only way it makes sense. Now, let's talk about Tertius. He's the first person that redacted Paul's epistles. Tertius, this is something I didn't see before. If I had seen this before, then my mistakes I made recently would have been avoided. Tertius did something different than I thought. He compressed at least 2 Pauline epistles into one letter, which became 2 Corinthians. Both letters being written by Paul, of course. He made it seem that the chronology of the 14 years in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 is the same 14 years mentioned in Galatians, even though that wasn't true. How did he pull that off? By merging the first part of 2 Corinthians with the other epistle to the Corinthians that have been compressed into one letter, as if they were one letter the entire time. By doing this, Tertius alters the chronology of Paul's ministry. Let's go with Philippians. Philippians is a combination, from what I can currently tell, either 2 or at the max 3 epistles that have been combined into one epistle. That also alters the Pauline chronology. How? Because Paul wrote about around 3 epistles to the Philippians. It says greetings and goodbye, greetings and goodbye, greetings and goodbye several times. And obviously he didn't write that all at the same time. That doesn't make any sense. Probably written many years apart, maybe even decades apart. So it doesn't make a whole lot of sense that Paul would write that all at the same time. But Tertius makes it seem like it was written all at once by compressing them into one letter. So we know that Tertius used late sources as inspiration to compress the material from Paul. Even on purpose, this would result in Paul paralleling other people when in fact he does not parallel the lives of other people. But Tertius made it seem like it was so. He made it seem like there were parallels between Paul and other individuals. This would help him move Paul out of the Ananian ministry, and he would be able to disassociate Ananias from Paul. And then he does something else that is just absolutely nothing but brilliant and ingenious. Tertius, in the we document of Acts, if he wrote it, it does seem like he did, because the we document of Acts parallels the situation that is taking place here. In the we document, Ananias of Damascus goes to see Paul. Well, actually, no, Paul goes to see him at Damascus. And the dating of this event is taking place around the AD 30s. But then he makes it seem like, when we go back to the epistles and we look at what he's done, when he changed Ananias out for Barnabas, he made it seem like Barnabas and Ananias were two separate individuals. That's exactly what Josephus does too. You see, this is a good example. Tertius is using Josephan language to manipulate the Pauline epistles. That's how I know this is happening in the AD 90s. He's using Josephan terminology, Josephan code titles to manipulate the letters. So the letters that we currently have don't come from before 70, even though they were written before 70. What we have is, we have replacement epistles, or replacement imitations that imitate the originals but are not the originals, written in the AD 90s. But that is the text that we currently have. And then after Tertius dies, Clement manipulates the text even further. Then after he dies, then Epaphroditus adds 3 more letters to the Corpus, which are accepted to be forgeries. That's Titus, 1st and 2nd Timothy, definitely not written by Paul at all. They completely contradict Paul practically, and it's not written by him at all. So that's how I know that there had to be authentic epistles, because they have been manipulated to the point in which Paul is being disassociated from very embarrassing events in the 1st century. He's being disassociated from Ananias, and I have come to the conclusion that they're removing Ananias from the text because it would make Christianity look terrible if Paul was taught by the man that murdered James. End result, Ananias should be understood as the more important person in the story. He's the person that's front and center of the situation. They have lessened his importance. They have decreased his importance, and they elevated Paul above his importance. That way Paul can mask Ananias' involvement. He's gone, and now we have a sanitized version of the Pauline Corpus that's been bleached over, cleaned up, and rewritten into something that the Christians can tolerate, into something that the early papacy could tolerate. And that's why they did what they did. It is as simple as that. They have manipulated the letters, and that's what I was trying to say. There's been some people that misinterpreted what I was saying, but no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that these are complete forgeries. All I said was there are copies of authentic epistles, which doesn't contradict consensus scholarship. It just doesn't. And actually, there's from what I can tell, there actually is a part of 2 Corinthians chapter 11 actually was part of a third letter that was compressed. Paul talked about fleeing from Aretas on 36 AD. That doesn't make any sense, because 2 Corinthians chapters 10 to, 2 Corinthians, wasn't there, hold on. There's something I forgot. I'm just looking it up just to be sure. Okay, we're good. 2 Corinthians chapter 10 to 13, chapters 10 to 13, I think represents 2 epistles, separate from the rest of the text. But they were written by the same man, but they've been compressed by a separate individual, that being Tertius. In 1 Corinthians, Paul says he wrote a letter concerning sexual immorality to the Corinthians, which was written before 1 Corinthians. That would be probably around 43 AD. Fine. But he would most likely have said to them that he fled from Aretas in that letter. It doesn't make any sense that he's writing this in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, which was written in 62 AD, when he was saying, okay, well, he got shipwrecked 3 times, because we know the shipwreck happened on 62 AD. And remember, Paul even admits he's boasting. So he's saying he was shipwrecked 3 times. He was actually shipwrecked 1 time. He was on that ship going to the Adriatic, going to Rome from the Adriatic Sea. So it looked to me like, okay, well, he's exaggerating the shipwreck, because that's just nonsense. He multiplied it by 3 times. 3 times 1 is 3. So that's what he's doing. 3 is a very suspicious number in most, if not pretty much every religion. So 3 is a 3 and 3. That's involved big time, and in all this. So 2 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 32 was likely to have been written as part of the lost letter to the Corinthians, written on 43 AD, because the context would just make better sense at the time. He's not going to be talking about, oh, he fled from Aretas on 62 AD. That just doesn't make any sense. Although he could have, and I'm not ruling out that he couldn't have done it. But the way he was boasting in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 doesn't make any sense. He says he's boasting about his weaknesses. Something like that. And 2 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 42 is not a weakness, because he managed to flee from Aretas. So if that is to be read in that manner, then Aretas doesn't, fleeing from Aretas successfully doesn't fit in that context. It would fit in an earlier letter that he wrote no later than 43 AD at least. Maybe 44 AD, but that's pushing it. 43 AD, I feel safer dating it there. So that's a lost letter to the Corinthians he wrote to them. I call it to the Corinthians. Then I'm not going to call it the real 1 Corinthians. That'll be too confusing. So he wrote to Corinth on 43 AD. Then he wrote 1 Corinthians on 44 AD. Then he wrote 2 Corinthians on 45 AD. And I know he wrote 2 Corinthians on 45 AD because Paul tells us about the 17 years. 17 years before he had that argument with James on 62 AD. That's back at about 45 AD. So that's just what's going on. So, any of you have any questions for me? While I'm still here? Now, tomorrow, I might be doing a show with Valiant. Can't make any promises on it. I hope so. Ocuzio says, why do most scholars date the gospel so early, in your opinion? Well, they put Mark in AD 70 because of Mark chapter 13, from what I know from them. Mark 13 expresses stress about the second temple being destroyed. It talks about it. But it's the only chapter in the entire gospel that talks about it. Literally. That's the problem. From what I remember, that's the only chapter in the gospel that talks about it. Mark 13 probably represents an earlier text similar to Mark, written on AD 70, or at the latest 79 AD, or 81 AD. 81's pushing it. But the rest of Mark seems to have been written by the person that we know as the author of Mark, whoever that was, because it's anonymous. But that person that wrote Mark was very familiar with Josephus. And the earliest person that was aware of this gospel was Papias, and he was writing around 110 AD. At the earliest he could have been writing about this was 100 or 99 AD, something like that. But the fact that it took that long, like, if Mark was fully written on AD 70 in the form we have it, what happened? It took 30, 40 years for someone to be aware of it? That doesn't make any sense. At least it would have taken 10 years for someone like Papias to talk about it. So Mark was written either in the early 90s or the late 90s. based on the evidence. I put it square in the last decade of the first century CE. That just makes better sense to me. Mark was harmonizing different forms of Christianity in defense of the Pauline Corpus. So, that being said, I think it's an error. Even Professor Robert Eisman says the Gospels could have been written in the 2nd century. Even Dr. Richard Carrier says that the way the Gospels is being dated is arbitrary, and I agree with both of them, hands down. While the authenticity of Paul's epistles is well in hand and well secure before 70 AD, the Gospels, hell no. And even saying they were written just after 70 is too soon. They are aware of way too many sources, different traditions of Christianity that certainly were not around by 70. It's necessary to delay the dating of the Gospels, to move them forward in time, because that's when they show up. Papias talks about Mark and Matthew. He doesn't know a thing about Luke, Acts, and John, Revelation. In fact, he knows about the Johannine. He said something about the Johannine epistles. He talked about the Petrine epistles. That stuff was written as counter forgeries against Paul. Well, actually, the Johannine epistles the Johannine epistles was written as a counter forgery against all of them. The Johannine epistles are trying to reconcile all their viewpoints, from what I remember. Cusio says, do you agree with scholars that date the Gospel of Thomas earlier than the canonicals? No, that's wrong. They don't date the Gospel of Thomas earlier than the canonicals. They date Thomas way after. Thomas, there's no consensus exactly on when it dates, except for that it dates in the 2nd century or 3rd century. They don't know which century it dates. However, we're told by Cyril of Jerusalem that the Gospel of Thomas was written at some point in the 1st century CE by Thomas, a disciple of Mani, the Persian prophet. And he specifically said this is not our Thomas from the New Testament, the famous Thomas. So this was a different Thomas, so that makes it a forgery. Thomas is too late. It's not useful, except for it is evidence that Thomas was aware of an earlier source that appears to have been the Q source. What scholars call Q source from the German word Quilla, which means question, which is supposed to be comprised of material from Matthew and Luke not found in Mark. Quotations of Jesus not found in Mark. Accusio says some sayings seem earlier. I'm completely fine with that. I don't have a problem with that at all. However, I don't think they were attributed to Jesus. They were all put into the mouth of Jesus somewhere at the turn of the century by Papias. If they had been put into the mouth of Jesus because they were circulating before 70 AD, Paul would have quoted them. He doesn't. Paul doesn't quote them at all. And that's why I don't think they were attributed to Jesus. They were someone else's sayings, but they have been attributed to Jesus by Papias. Papias even admits to writing the expositions of the Lord, or the Logia to Krios, the sayings of the Lord. And he says Matthew utilized a Logia as if they use his work to do it. Another way of interpreting it is Papias wrote his own copy, and what happened is Matthew himself read a compressed Stoic text and attributed them to Jesus himself, and then Papias did so afterwards. That could just easily be the case. Either way works with me. I'm not dead set on it happened one way or the other just yet. I'm still thinking that through. Just going to take care of this just real quick. Done. Ah, dropped my phone. Lovely. Okay. Pretty soon here, I'm going to be doing a very long show, and then I'm going to plan on doing an interview. I'm going to be doing an interview soon that will take care of some of the issues that have come up recently. And we'll put the last few days well behind us. We'll forget about them and move on. I got some more material coming out about Paul's epistles. I can't wait to share it with all of you, including my patrons. So if any of you want early access to this, subscribe to the Patreon, pay up on the Patreon, and you can see my articles early. Ocuzio says, if the resurrection hypothesis was true, would the evidence that we have make any sense? No, it wouldn't. I don't think it does. And the simplest way for me to put it is, Paul says he had visions of Jesus in his so-called citing of the eyewitnesses. He never names who the eyewitnesses are. And the 500 men, it sounds like Paul got the idea of 500 men from the 500 cavalry that led King Bauzus out of Adiabeni and fled to Israel, which was a very famous story in the 1st century CE that was taught. But it happened in 4 BCE. He was fleeing to Herod. He received land and tax exemption from Herod. So that seems to be the famous 500, which means that's not admissible evidence for a resurrection of Jesus. In fact, it explains why Paul was ignorant on the matter, because Josephus tells us there were just 500 cavalry. He doesn't even tell us of the names. It's as if their names were not known. And Paul probably was having the same problem, that the names of those cavalry officers were not known either. So the fact of the matter is, it looks like Paul seems to be setting up some sort of typology between Jesus and King Bauzus. That really puts a dent on the reliability of Paul's epistles to extract a historical Jesus. Not that I have a problem with a historical Jesus, it just means we have to minimize him a bit more than historians would like, or historicists, I mean. There are more people coming out slowly saying that Jesus didn't exist, or he's minimal, and it's just the evidence that we have is very, very problematic. It's very, very sketchy for a Jesus. We can barely find a Jesus. At best, a historical Jesus that I could locate from my point of view, is that as far as Paul is concerned, Jesus incarnated on earth as a man. He's not saying Jesus is a man. He said Jesus incarnated as a man. That's not the same thing. That's actually a problem. He says he incarnated as a man. So he's claiming after the death of this man, he never tells us who it was in the first place. He says that man was the so-called incarnation of Jesus. That's not good evidence. That's actually not good, because that would suggest Jesus was a god, as far as Paul was concerned, part of a Jewish pantheon. Although he doesn't try to put it in that manner. He tries to say Jesus was just a son of God. So therefore he's not part of a pantheon because he's not a god, he's a son of God. This is the way it works with him. So it seems to me that Paul that would explain Galatians chapter 3, by the way. In Galatians chapter 3, Paul makes a case to the people that are arguing against him, saying, look, we don't believe that your Jesus was crucified. He's like, oh, you foolish Galatians. Jesus was portrayed as crucified in Jerusalem. So you can see, Paul is struggling to place Jesus' crucifixion on earth, and Galatians was one of the last letters that Paul wrote in the AD 60s. So the fact of the matter is, he was having difficulty placing Jesus' crucifixion on earth. In his earlier letters, he was arguing that Jesus was crucified in heaven. And now he tried to make the case that he was crucified on earth later on, which is really, really, really strange. But over time, you can tell his letters evolved from a totally mythical Jesus into an earthly crucified Jesus. Since 1 Corinthians, he's going upwards to all the way up to Philemon, his last letter. Yeah. Ocuzio says, ha ha ha. Then he says, Paul uses the term Son of God very strangely. Totally agree. That's exactly the point of what I'm saying. He's using the term Son of God very, very strangely. Mm-hmm. You see, this is the issue. We have to weed out the Christians that say Ananias is Paul from the Christians that say Paul is not Ananias. Because there are two different forms of Christianity. So the idea of Ananias is Paul isn't wrong, but the idea that Paul is not Ananias is also not wrong either. If we understand the context of those identifications and separations. Now, in history, are they the same person? Hell no. Not in history. They're not the same person in history. Only in certain sections of literature are they the same person. But, hey, Paul being taught by Ananias himself is just as good. We don't need them to be the same person. He's being taught by him. That's not far off. That's not that much different. And Paul was taught by Ananias, and he was working for him. He was working for the high priesthood. And I'm not the only one saying he was working for the high priesthood either, although not for the same reasons. Not for the same reasons. Alright, so I think I'm going to be done for tonight. But before I go, I'm going to read this real quick. Something that I wrote. Some people do not understand that keeping an open mind is a good thing. Sometimes a person needs to change his mind often until he or she understands. Sometimes that person needs to keep making a particular mistake until that person realizes it is actually a mistake. Sometimes it's good to keep thinking about a possibility until you are certain it is not a possibility. And that's what some people will never understand. It's part of this methodology. In the end, nothing is absolutely certain unless the evidence is really, 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 and I mean really overwhelming. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of that going around. I'm talking about the kind of evidence that nobody debates. Like nobody would debate that Jerusalem was destroyed on AD 70. That's one example of a non-debatable fact that nobody debates. Something's stuck there. Excuse me. Cuzio says, totally agree with what you wrote. The good news is, until I see better evidence, I have come to a conclusion, and that conclusion will be revealed soon. A conclusion like you've never seen on this channel. The end of my research on the New Testament is at hand. Finally. And I have to tell all you this was not an easy job. And researching this was way harder and way more tedious than researching the Old Testament. Another thing that I've learned in my experience dealing with, like talking to scholars and everything. Stuart C. donated $3.87. Wow. Thank you, man. He says, appreciate your insights, Jacob. Anytime, man. Anytime. If you have any questions, if you have Facebook, or you want to join me on Discord, or you want to do both, do that. Contact me. I would love to answer anything you ask me. Another thing I want to point out is, this is why, Stuart sees as $5 Aussie. Yes, but it came out as, it's $3.87 for me. That's cool. I appreciate it very much. Very much. Donations like that keeps this channel going, my friends. I'm going to end this by saying, this is one of the reasons why people like Dr. Robert M. Price maintains a very, very open mind. And people criticize him for it. But I think it's a good thing, because it takes an open mind like that to get through this. Because really and truly, without maintaining an open mind, you're actually going to have a harder time understanding what you're studying. And you may, any of you that are are closed-minded in some way to this, and to the text you read, you're not going to completely understand it if you have a closed mind at all. You have to maintain an open mind. You have to really take a crowbar and open your mind up. You're really going to have to do that, because if you don't, you're always going to be in some sort of chaos. You're going to make certain mistakes like I used to make, because I've been there. It takes a lot to get out of that. It does. In fact, people that research this don't even realize that they're making this mistake, but they do. They do make this mistake. Ocuzio says, and stop reading the New Testament theologically. I'm not sure if you're telling me that, or you're just saying that as riding along what I'm saying. If it's a latter, then I agree. If it's a former, I don't understand, because I don't interpret it theologically. I'm not a theist. I'm practically atheist. Alright, my friends, for real this time, I'm going to have to get off here. It's been a lovely 46 minutes and 27 seconds. So I'll be seeing all of you later. Good night.